All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Sorry for the little bit of a delay. It took for a second for it to click in. Hi Wayne, how you doing? Hope everybody's doing okay and having a great day. Welcome to Friday. Coming to you live from wonderful, wonderful, yet rainy Chicago, Illinois. And of course, I found out it was rainy when my son and I stepped outside so I could walk him to school. So that's just kind of how that goes. Anyway, can't get me down though. It's Friday and I have coffee. So it's all good. So, anyway, so today I wanted to talk a little bit about self care for the investigator. It's a topic that I can tell you from experience doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Hey, Keith. So, I just wanted to point out that there's a few things that we as investigators probably need to keep in mind as far as self care goes, because not for nothing, we get exposed to trauma on quite a regular basis, even if we don't realize it. And just to give you a little bit of background where I'm coming from this, um, so I've been teaching for WZ mainly in the law enforcement sector for a couple of years on issues such as trauma informed interviewing and law. Now I'm kind of going into more private sector stuff too. So hopefully a lot of people will see me more. But one of the things that happened was when I was putting together the trauma informed training for the Chicago Police Department. That was right around the time that I personally got diagnosed with post traumatic stress disorder. Um, and so that's what really kind of drove my passion about this. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to be telling you this morning comes from research, but a lot of it also just comes from personal experience. And I just want people to understand where this can affect us. Um, and yes, Tony, I did present on this topic in Nashville at the Elite Training Days a couple years ago. So anyway, with trauma informed for the investigator, I think it's first off very important to understand what traumas are, and they can be different for everybody. A lot of people assume trauma is something incredibly heavy like combat or major car wrecks, being a victim of violent crime, something like that. And yes, those are all large traumas, but it can also be other things. And especially if we think about it in terms of the workplace, there's a lot of things that are traumatizing in the workplace that a lot of times we don't take into consideration. So like as in investigators in the private sector, maybe we're seeing sexual harassment claims. Well, that can be very traumatizing for a person, especially if they feel like it's a quid pro quo and their job is at risk. So that would be a livelihood threat, which would make it very traumatizing. So dealing with people who've had these traumas from sexual harassment training or sexual harassment situations, workplace violence, what we've seen over the last few years with the stores being mobbed and looted, and a lot of uptick in violent crime, and especially in a lot of big cities and a lot of retail sectors. I mean, you've heard about downtown Chicago and downtown San Francisco. So things like that can be very traumatizing to the people that we're talking to, and to the people that we interview and things like that. And now you may be saying, okay, well, I get it. You want me to take into account the people I interview may be traumatized. And the answer is, yeah, I definitely want to do that. But I also want you to understand that taking that in all the time, us taking that in, talking to people, hearing about other people's traumas, possibly seeing the aftermath of these traumatizing incidents can be traumatizing to us as well. So you have multiple different things. And even if you're in HR, the death of a parent, long-term care of a parent, things like, made divorces, major changes, things that you might be dealing with as a HR professional, that's going to be traumatizing to the person we're talking to. And by constantly listening to this, it can be traumatizing to us. So if you talk about what's considered a trauma, it can be something, a huge event, or it can be a long situation over time. Where does it hit us though? So I've talked about the fact that I have post-traumatic stress disorder. Mine was job related from 21 years in the CPD, 16 as a detective. Short version of it, 100 crime scenes was okay. 101 was too many. Why? I don't know. It just was. So that being said, how does this affect us as investigators? It can be stuff that we see ourselves, or it can be stuff we experience through other people retelling their story to us. And so there's a couple of things, a couple of different types of post traumatic stress that will pop up in investigators. One being compassion fatigue. Now, compassion fatigue is a lot like, most of the time it gets called burnout. It's a little bit different, but it's where you basically, you get to the point where you're hearing so much negativity or so many stressful situations at work that it just feels like you can't recharge your batteries. Your weekend off isn't enough. The good news with this kind of compassion fatigue is a lot of times a break, a vacation can really help recharge the batteries and help out and all that kind of good stuff. So that's the lowest level. Then you've got vicarious trauma. And that's where you're taking on other people's trauma. It's not necessarily a post-traumatic, full-blown post-traumatic stress, but with vicarious trauma, it's a lot like, if compassion fatigue is burnout, I'm just hearing too much and they need to take a break. Vicarious trauma is more like, it's totally changing my view of the world. And so that's one of the things. This is why a lot of people say police officers are very cynical. At the very least, a lot of times we've had our view of the world change so much and so often that it becomes kind of a permanent shift there. And then you've got secondary post-traumatic stress disorder, which is basically post-traumatic stress disorder, except it's for issues that did not necessarily happen to you, but from repeated exposure. So, the thing to think about with repeated exposure, I always point out the fact that, officers that work at the front desk of a police station constantly taking in reports, that can cause secondary PTSD. One of the largest instances of secondary post-traumatic stress that affects a group of people is social workers, teachers, things like that. Basically any kind of helping profession, and I include investigators in helping professions. So definitely something there. So how do we recognize this in ourselves? Because I'll tell you this, my post-traumatic stress disorder went on for several years, completely untreated, and it caused a lot of problems in my life, but I never really realized I had it. And that's one of the things. A lot of times we don't really recognize it because we expect it to be, oh, I have this great big flashback. And that did happen in my case. But, before that, there were still a lot of the functionalities that came about that I didn't realize. So I didn't want to point out, basically, there's three main symptoms of post-traumatic stress. I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but I will say this. You've got, first off, you have to have a traumatic incident, or in the case of investigators who are constantly hearing things, you're constantly hearing it. That is the stressing event. Then you've got an intrusion event. And this is where it can be either very easy or very hard to recognize. So with the intrusion event, that's what everybody thinks of with the flashback. Now that could be just overwhelming feelings of being in that traumatic situation. So you may not be able to pinpoint exactly why you're feeling that way. This is why a lot of times people don't realize they've got this. And then eventually it can be, and it's not the same for everybody, but it can be one of those things where your brain simply goes right back to the traumatic incident. And that's what we consider the flashback. And that is exactly what we were talking about with not only do I feel it, I see it, I hear it, I smell it. It's in your head, but you see, hear, smell, and all that kind of good stuff. And that's a very messed up feeling. And I can say that's a very messed up feeling because I felt it. It's really distressing because your brain goes somewhere you don't want it to go, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. And that's a very helpless feeling. So that leads to the third symptom, though. The third symptom, and the one that I would look out for, and I think is probably one of the easiest ones to spot in ourselves, is avoidance behaviors. If there are certain things that we decide we cannot talk about, we cannot do, we cannot be around, that is one of the things that will pop up because the avoidance behaviors will become pathological. The intrusion event is so distressing that the avoidance behaviors become pathological. For instance, I haven't seen the news in about 8 years. I just can't watch it. It drives me nuts. It's tough. It's what we would consider a triggering event. So that being said, and that can be kind of crazy too. Does it affect my life? You better believe it. My wife is a complete news hound. She watches everything. Fox, MSNBC, CNBC, you name it. She loves it. She loves every little bit of it. And she likes to talk to me about it, which is, it can be kind of distressing because I do have to say after about 5 minutes, I'm like, okay, honey, that's about all I can do right now. We'll have to pick this up later. But that's an avoidance behavior. And that's obviously very easy to tell with a lot of ourselves. So those are things to think about. Now, you may also find yourself at some point getting triggered. And with triggering is just a very, you may or may not understand what the trigger is, but you just find yourself exceedingly uncomfortable. You find yourself in a very heightened state of anxiety, and maybe you don't even know why. But this is very common. I will agree with a lot of people. I think being triggered and traumatic event might be a little bit overused, but it's definitely there and it's definitely a thing. So that's something to think about. So then the question comes up, well, what do we do about this? So, you know, if you're triggered, if you find the immediate, if you find yourself in a triggered state, oh my God, I'm feeling so anxious. This is really tough. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to feel about this. I would suggest grounding techniques. Now, in our trauma informed class, I go over quite a few of these, but at the simplest form, a grounding technique really is taking your fear from that's way out there and bringing yourself back into your particular space where you are right now. And for a lot of people, that's safety. So you can say a safety affirmation, anything like that. But, one of the best ways of doing it is, first off, put your feet flat on the ground. Put your hands on your desk, armchairs, knees, whatever it is, but you're having all points of contact. Okay? All points of contact with yourself, the ground, your furniture, whatever, but you can feel it. Now, then the idea there is just focus in on where you're at and keep in mind that your problems are out there. You are in here. And all grounding techniques is essentially that. It's pulling your worry from way out there, pulling it back into yourself in here. So that's the short term. How do you deal with it in the moment? But then long term, look, I don't have flashbacks anymore, and my life is very well adjusted, although I still don't watch the news. That being said, I'll be the first to tell you I had 4.5 years of therapy. So therapy is always fantastic, whether it's group, whether it's individual. That's a good thing. Then the other thing is also to have hobbies, have something outside of work. Now, I know that's kind of seems like a no-brainer, but think about how we approach our jobs a lot of times. A lot of times our jobs aren't just our jobs. They then become our identities. And I will say police officers are ridiculously guilty of this, where I'm a cop 24/7. It's everything I do, everything I am. And it's the way you view the world, everything. So you need to find a way to disassociate from that. If it's joining a sports league, hanging out with friends, focusing in on family, find a hobby that has nothing to do with the things that are, bringing us stress and trauma in our lives. So that's the big thing. And then just make sure that you're communicate with, your significant other, communicate with your peers. A lot of times traumas will grow just because we don't talk about them. In communicating with significant others, I will say this for police officers, a lot of times we think that we're protecting our families by not saying anything. Actually, we could be alienating. So, in a lot of times with your immediate family, significant other, parents, whatever, communicating with them, it makes them feel closer because they're more of a part of your life, but also it's a sounding board for you. Now, I'm not saying go into any gory details or something they don't really need to know, but you can acknowledge that today was a tough day. I saw a really tough case. So, well, with that being said, I think that's pretty much all I got for you guys today. I really hope that everybody has a wonderful weekend. I hope that you consider our trauma-informed training if you haven't gotten it, because I think it's very helpful and really applicable across the board. So other than that, I think that's all I got for you. So everybody have a wonderful, wonderful weekend, and I'll talk to you guys later.